The Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital horror story. What you are about to discover in this true story will chill your blood and make you understand why certain places should never be abandoned. The walls of Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital still hold the echoes of suffering so intense that even the most skeptical emerge transformed from this visit. The story I'm about to tell you took place just 3 years ago, and the witnesses involved still refuse to speak about it openly. You will understand why this establishment was closed in the utmost secrecy, and why local authorities strictly forbid access to this cursed building. Prepare to dive into the purest horror, because what happened in these corridors defies human understanding. The history of Willowbrook. Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital had been built in 1923 on an isolated hill, 20 kilometers from the town of Ravens Hollow. This imposing 4-story red brick building had been designed to accommodate 200 patients with severe mental disorders. For 70 years, this institution had operated according to the controversial methods of the era, using treatments now considered pure torture. The archives reveal that more than 3,000 patients died in this hospital, many under mysterious circumstances that were never solved. In 1993, the establishment had closed its doors after a series of scandals involving illegal experiments on patients. The medical staff had been accused of performing savage lobotomies on patients who were not even consenting. Some testimonies spoke of isolation chambers where patients were tied up for weeks without food or water. The electroshock room had been nicknamed by patients the death chamber, so brutal and repeated were the sessions. The abandoned years. After closure, the building had been abandoned and left to the elements, quickly becoming a sinister ruin. The broken windows let in rain and wind, creating an atmosphere of total desolation. Vegetation had invaded the corridors, giving the place a terrifying, post-apocalyptic appearance. Graffiti on the walls testified to the passage of vandals and urban explorers, but many emerged speaking of unexplained phenomena. The inhabitants of Ravens Hollow carefully avoided the hill, telling stories of mysterious screams that echoed at night. Some witnesses claimed to have seen silhouettes moving behind the broken windows, even though the building was supposed to be empty. Local authorities had installed prohibition signs and barriers, but this didn't prevent the most daring from venturing into this cursed ruin. The investigation team. It is in this context that our story begins. On a cold October night in 2021, Sarah Matthews, a 28-year-old investigative journalist, had decided to do a report on abandoned psychiatric hospitals. She was accompanied by her cameraman, Marcus Chen, a 35-year-old man accustomed to filming in... Their team also included Tommy Rodriguez, an expert in paranormal phenomena, and Lisa Williams, a psychologist specializing in trauma. They had obtained special authorization from local authorities to enter the grounds of Willowbrook Hospital. Sarah had spent months gathering information about this establishment, discovering disturbing testimonies from former employees. A retired nurse, Mary Henderson, had confided horrifying details about the last years of operation. According to her, the most violent patients were locked in underground cells whose existence appeared on no official plan. These dungeons were used for the most severe punishments, and some patients disappeared there permanently. Mary had also mentioned experiments conducted by Dr. Krantz, a German doctor who arrived mysteriously in 1945. This practitioner had introduced extreme therapeutic methods that resembled Nazi experiments more than medical treatments. Dr. Krantz's files had mysteriously disappeared when the hospital closed, fueling conspiracy theories. The night of investigation. Sarah hoped to find in the hospital ruins clues about these secret experiments. She had equipped her team with high-definition cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors. Marcus had insisted on bringing powerful lamps and backup batteries, sensing that the electricity would be cut off. Tommy had brought his paranormal detection instruments, temperature detectors, and motion sensors. Lisa was there to analyze the psychological impact of the environment on the team and document the traumatic effects. They had arrived at the scene around 10 o'clock, on a particularly oppressive, moonless night. Fog rose from the valley, enveloping the hill in a spectral veil that made the atmosphere even more sinister. Their vehicle's headlights dimly illuminated the rusty entrance gate, whose twisted bars seemed to form grimacing faces. Sarah had immediately felt a sensation of deep unease when approaching the main building. The imposing facade rose before them like a sleeping monster, its gaping windows resembling empty eyes. First floor exploration. Marcus had started filming upon their arrival, capturing the gothic atmosphere of the place with his professional lens. Tommy had immediately noted anomalies on his instruments. The temperature had dropped 5 degrees near the building. Lisa was already documenting the team's physiological reactions: accelerated heart rate, excessive sweating despite the cold. They had forced the main entrance door, whose hinges had creaked sinisterly in the nocturnal silence. The interior of the hospital was plunged in absolute darkness, which their lamps barely pierced. The smell that reigned in the reception hall was a mixture of humidity, mold, and something more repugnant. Sarah had identified this smell as that of decomposition, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once.
The walls were covered with recent graffiti, but also older traces that resembled claw marks. Marcus filmed each detail methodically, noting that some marks were too high to have been made by human hands. Tommy was recording abnormal electromagnetic fluctuations, his instruments going haywire for no apparent reason. Lisa was beginning to feel an unexplained anxiety that didn't correspond to any classic environmental stress. They had decided to start their exploration with the ground floor, where the administrative services were located. The waiting room was still furnished with orange plastic chairs typical of the 80s, covered with thick dust. Yellowed magazines lay on the tables, their pages stuck together by humidity and the passage of time. Sarah had noticed that the dates on these magazines all stopped at September 1993, the month before the final closure. The patient files. Behind the reception counter, scattered files revealed patient names and disturbing diagnoses. Marcus illuminated the documents while Sarah read aloud certain particularly disturbing passages. One file mentioned a patient named Robert Chen, admitted for schizophrenia, who had developed an obsession with underground voices. According to staff notes, Robert claimed to hear calls for help coming from the hospital's basements. He had been transferred to an isolation cell after attempting to dig the floor of his room with his bare nails. The file stopped abruptly, with no mention of the patient's release or death. Tommy had detected a significant temperature drop near the reception counter without logical explanation. Lisa noted that the team was beginning to show signs of post-traumatic stress without having experienced direct trauma. They had continued their exploration toward the medical offices, where obsolete equipment still lay around. An electroshock machine from the 60s sat in a corner, its electrodes still stained with brown substances. The medical equipment Sarah had discovered in a drawer photographs of patients before and after their experimental treatments. The images showed terrifying physical transformations, deformed faces, completely empty expressions. Marcus had noticed that some photographs moved slightly in his camera's viewfinder, as if the subjects were breathing. Tommy was recording faint voices on his devices, indistinct whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Lisa was beginning to experience auditory hallucinations that she first attributed to the stress of the situation. They had then gone up to the first floor, where the patient rooms were located. The main corridor extended for 50 meters, punctuated by doors, many of which were still locked. Sarah had forced the first door with a crowbar, revealing a 3 by 2 meter cell. The metal bed was still equipped with restration straps, some stained with dark substances. On the wall, inscriptions carved in the plaster testified to the patient's distress.
Marcus read these desperate messages aloud.
"They come at night. The voices never stop. Help us." One particularly disturbing inscription said,
Dr. Krantz takes us down below. The patient's cells. Tommy had noted that the temperature in this cell was 10 degrees lower than that of the corridor. Lisa was beginning to hear faint moaning that she couldn't locate precisely. They had visited about 10 similar cells, each revealing additional horrors. In one of them, they had found claw marks on the concrete floor, as if someone had tried to dig. Another cell contained childish drawings on the walls, representing creatures with impossible forms. Sarah had photographed these drawings, noting that they seemed to move slightly under the lighting of her flash. Marcus had captured unexplained luminous orbs that appeared and disappeared in his lens. Tommy was recording strange sounds, creaking, whispering, footsteps with no identifiable origin. Lisa was beginning to show signs of dissociation, speaking of sensations of being watched. It was at this moment that their equipment began to malfunction inexplicably. Note: at this point in the original text, there's a promotional message asking readers to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications for the continuation of the story. I've omitted this as it's clearly marketing content. Equipment failures. The batteries in their lamps were draining at an abnormal rate, forcing them to conserve their lighting. Marcus's cameras were recording constant interference, vertical lines that disrupted the image. Tommy found that his measuring instruments were giving aberrant values, oscillating between impossible extremes. Lisa was beginning to lose track of time, having the impression that they had been exploring the hospital for endless hours. Sarah had noticed that their watches all showed different times, as if time itself was disturbed. They had decided to continue to the second floor, where the specialized services were located. The main staircase creaked under their steps, its rotten wooden steps threatening to give way with each movement. The metal railing was covered with a viscous substance that stuck to hands and gave off a putrid smell. Marcus had slipped on a step, his camera briefly capturing the image of a silhouette in the darkness. Tommy had helped him up, noticing that the filmed form was only visible on the control screen. Second floor horrors. Lisa was beginning to talk to herself, responding to voices that the others couldn't hear. Sarah was worried about her colleague's mental state, but she herself was beginning to feel a hostile presence. The second floor was organized differently, with narrower corridors and lower ceilings. The atmosphere there was even more oppressive. The saws, scalpels, and forceps were arranged with meticulous care, as if someone had recently prepared them. Sarah had noticed that the instruments were free of rust, unlike the rest of the hospital's equipment. Marcus filmed these disturbing details, noting that the reflections on the blades seemed to form deformed faces. Tommy was recording intense magnetic fluctuations near the operating table. Lisa refused to enter the room, claiming she heard cries of pain coming from inside. Dr. Krantz's laboratory. They had then explored Dr. Krantz's laboratory, a room that Sarah had been particularly eager to visit. The door was locked by a sophisticated security system, unusual for a hospital from the 80s. Tommy had managed to force the electronic lock, revealing a perfectly preserved laboratory. The scientific equipment was arranged with military precision, as if someone maintained it regularly. Jars containing anatomical specimens were lined up on shelves, bathing in a yellowish liquid. Sarah had identified human brains, unidentified organs, and impossible cellular formations. Marcus filmed these horrors, noticing that some specimens seemed to pulse faintly. Tommy detected abnormal radiation emanating from the jars, his counters going dangerously haywire. Lisa had refused to enter the laboratory, staying in the corridor in a state of shock. The secret documents. At the back of the room, they had discovered Dr. Krantz's desk, still covered with classified documents. The files revealed experiments on brain modification and the creation of altered states of consciousness. Sarah read horrifying accounts of operations performed on living and conscious patients. A series of photographs showed the stages of an experiment called Project Mindbridge. The images revealed patients whose skulls had been opened, electrodes implanted in their brains. Marcus documented this evidence of Nazi experiments, understanding the scope of the crimes committed in this hospital. Tommy had discovered audio recordings of experimental sessions, patient screams mixed with the doctor's clinical notes. Lisa was beginning to have panic attacks, claiming she heard the voices of the victims. In the center of the desk, Dr. Krantz's personal notebook detailed his true motivations. The last entries dated from September 1993, just before the hospital's closure. The dimensional entities. Krantz described his attempts to communicate with what he called dimensional entities. According to him, his experiments had opened portals to other planes of existence. The patients were not guinea pigs, but biological antennas designed to capture paranormal signals. Sarah now understood why the hospital had been closed so brutally and its archives classified. Things began to deteriorate rapidly after Tommy was recording impossible sounds, voices speaking non-existent languages, inexplicable music. Lisa had completely lost contact with reality, conversing with invisible presences. Sarah was trying to maintain team cohesion, but she herself was beginning to see hallucinations. Shadows moved in her peripheral vision, silhouettes that disappeared when she looked at them directly. The third floor. They had decided to go up to the third floor, where the high-security services were located. The staircase leading to this level was blocked by a padlocked metal gate. Tommy had forced the padlock, revealing a corridor different from the others, cleaner, better preserved. The emergency lighting still worked on this floor, diffusing a sinister blood-red light. The third floor cells were equipped with sophisticated surveillance systems. Sarah had noticed that some cameras were still moving, following their movements with disturbing precision. Marcus filmed these automatic cameras, wondering who could still control them. Tommy detected complex electronic signals as if a computer system was still active. Lisa refused to advance, claiming she heard calls for help coming from the cells. The modified cells. They had forced the first door, discovering a cell with padded walls. The padding material was torn in places, revealing complex metal structures. Sarah had identified antennas and electronic circuits integrated into the walls. Marcus filmed these installations, understanding that the cells were modified Faraday cages. Tommy measured electromagnetic fields of industrial intensity in this cell. Lisa began to convulse, claiming she was receiving signals directly to her brain. In the center of the cell, they had found a metal chair equipped with electrodes and straps. The device was connected to an 80s computer, still in working order. Sarah had turned on the machine, revealing patient data dating from the closure. The files contained brain recordings and neural activity maps. Marcus documented this evidence of mind control experiments. Tommy recorded complex electronic parasites emanating from the computer. Lisa had collapsed, claiming she heard the thoughts of former patients. The experimental chambers. They had explored other similar cells, each equipped with different experimental devices. One cell contained a still-functional sensory isolation chamber. Sarah had opened the chamber, revealing a viscous liquid and a sickening chemical smell. Marcus filmed the inside of the chamber, noting organic traces on the walls. Tommy detected abnormal radiation coming from the liquid. Lisa refused to approach, claiming she heard moaning coming from the chamber. Another cell housed what looked like a primitive brain scanner. The device was still powered, its screens displaying complex neurological patterns. Sarah had tried to understand this data, identifying impossible brain waves.
Marcus filmed the screens, noticing that the patterns changed in real time. Tommy recorded radio signals coming from the device, unknown frequencies. Lisa was beginning to speak in a foreign language she didn't know. The restricted access at the end of the corridor, they had discovered a door marked Restricted Access. This door was equipped with a still-active biometric security system. Tommy had managed to bypass the security, revealing an elevator leading to the basements. Sarah remembered the testimonies mentioning secret underground levels. Marcus hesitated to go down, sensing that the true horrors were below. Tommy insisted on continuing the exploration, his instruments detecting major anomalies underground. Lisa begged the team to leave, claiming she heard hostile voices coming from the depths. Sarah had made the decision to go down, determined to discover the ultimate secrets of the hospital. Descent into the underground. The elevator descended slowly, its cables creaking in an alarming way. The indicator lights showed underground levels: -1, -2, -3. Tommy counted the floors, realizing that the hospital had 3 hidden levels. Lisa had curled up in a corner of the elevator, trembling uncontrollably. Marcus filmed the descent, capturing the team's growing anxiety. Sarah consulted the hospital plans, noting that these levels did not appear on them. The elevator had stopped at level -3, its doors opening onto a dark corridor. The air was saturated with a chemical smell mixed with something putrid. Tommy detected dangerously high radiation levels. Lisa refused to leave the elevator, hysterical and incoherent. The secret laboratories. Sarah and Marcus had explored the corridor, discovering secret laboratories. The first laboratory contained vats filled with a greenish liquid. Marcus filmed these installations, noticing that the liquid bubbled slightly. Tommy measured abnormal temperatures near the vats. Sarah had read the labels on the vats: experimental specimens, cell cultures, organic matter. Some vats contained vaguely human forms, floating in the liquid. Marcus had zoomed in on these forms, identifying deformed faces and atrophied limbs. Tommy recorded heartbeats emanating from the vats. Lisa had run back up to the elevator, terrorized by what she had glimpsed. The hybrid experiments. Sarah had discovered a laboratory notebook detailing the experiments of level -3. The notes described attempts to create hybrids between humans and extraterrestrial entities. Marcus documented this evidence of illegal genetic experiments. Tommy detected complex biological signals coming from the specimens. At the back of the laboratory, they had found an observation chamber with portholes. Sarah had looked through the portholes, discovering an immense room filled with equipment. The room contained dozens. Tommy measured vibrations coming from the room, as if something living was there. Lisa was screaming from the elevator, begging the team to go back up immediately. The main chamber. They had forced the door to the main room, entering what looked like a science fiction laboratory. Hundreds of vats were aligned in several rows, each containing a different specimen. Sarah had identified human brains kept alive artificially. Marcus filmed these horrors, his hands trembling with emotion. Tommy detected intense electrical activities coming from the brains. Lisa had lost consciousness in the elevator, overwhelmed by psychic signals. In the center of the room, a central computer controlled all the experiments. Sarah had accessed the files, discovering decades of secret experimentation. The data revealed that Dr. Krantz had created an interface between human brains and interdimensional entities. Marcus documented this evidence of paranormal experiments. Tommy recorded communications between the brains, impossible information exchanges. The computer indicated that 72 brains were still active. The final discovery. Sarah now understood that the hospital had never really closed.
the experiments continuing in secret. Marcus filmed the control screens, showing brain activity in real time. Tommy detected communication attempts coming from the brains. Lisa had regained consciousness, but she was now speaking with the voice of a deceased patient. At the back of the room, they had discovered Dr. Krantz's personal office. The man was still there, mummified in his chair, connected to his own machines. Sarah had realized with horror that Krantz had made himself the final subject of his experiments. Marcus filmed